In the final business bulletin this hour, consumers spent the most on grocery stores and supermarkets in December last year. That's compared to the same period last year. And it's according to BankservAfrica, with transactions almost doubling in value at 50 billion rand, with a 6% jump in volumes to 47 million recorded. Now, BankservAfrica's Solly Bellingan joins us now for more. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Solly. Now, despite that financial pressure that consumers felt in 2023, if your data is anything to go by, wallets were certainly open and cards were being swiped in December. Give us some details on your findings on December's holiday spending.
Hi, Ntokozo. Thanks very much for having me. Yes, we've seen a couple of interesting findings if we have to compare our data from this December 2023 to the previous year. And a couple of interesting things. There's been quite a lot of spend, as usual. It is Christmas time, and we've seen that people had still used their cards. We see, just to make sure that everybody understands, we see only transactions that are interbank. So therefore, if a consumer with one bank's card uses a card at a bank, at a merchant that banks at the same bank, we wouldn't see those transactions. But we see enough in order to give some views on some of the trends. So just out of interest sake, I mean, in overall, 112 billion rand was spent on using cards in stores at point of sale during December. The interesting thing was the number that you mentioned, the 50 billion rand that you mentioned. In the previous year, that was the number spent at retailers and grocery stores. That number in the previous year was around 26 billion. It didn't grow as much in terms of the number of transactions, but the average transaction, therefore, grew from about 580 rand to 1,048 rand. So that's almost double the transaction value. And then the other interesting thing that we then saw coupled with that is the fact that fuel purchases, or shall I say, purchases at service stations had declined by 18%, and purchases at clothing stores, categories of clothing stores, also fell by about 11%. And that tells us that there's been a bit of a shift in spend this year. So last year, it would appear that there was more spend on necessities. This year, we see more spend per transaction as well at the retail stores. So it would appear that people did more Christmas shopping this year than last year. I think last year there was more necessities being spent on. And the interesting one was fuel. One can only then assume that if there was such a decline in fuel, maybe there was less travel this year around, and maybe people stuck around at home and used some of the money to have a good Christmas.
And to spend on that grocery shopping to make sure that the lunches are there. Solly, talk us through then how consumers, you mentioned those card transactions, but how was consumer spending or paying for their spend over that period? Is South Africa still a cash society?
So, yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a very topical conversation in the payments industry at the moment, the demand for cash. So what we have seen is we process all orders that banks place for cash to be available in their branches and ATMs. So if we look at I just mentioned 112 billion rand. We've also seen the cash orders for this period in December total 81 billion rand. So if you think about it, almost just as well, and I wouldn't say almost just as well, but probably about 40% of transaction usage, if you took card and cash together, 81 billion rand was the cash demand over December. So the interesting thing is there's definitely still a need for cash, and people still are looking to use cash. It's also important to note, therefore, that we don't see the actual volume of cash transactions. We unfortunately only know what the demand for cash is. The banks order this from us you would understand that there's no data element that gets stored somewhere if somebody uses cash to buy something somewhere. So there definitely is a demand for cash. There was a slight decline compared to the previous year. So the good thing is people are using more cards and more electronic devices. But the point is, cash is definitely still around 81 billion rand. That was the demand for cash in December, and that was the amount of money that was ordered by banks to ensure that cash is available. And as usual, we saw the peak times in terms of making sure that there's enough cash available in ATMs and branches. The peak times were around the 14th of December. 14th of December is obviously just before the new public holiday that we had, where we could celebrate the Springboks win last year. And that was also the start of the festive season. And the other big demand for cash was around 22nd of December, just before the Christmas weekend. And so the banks needed to ensure that there's enough cash available in their infrastructure for their customer demands.
And Solly, just looking ahead to the rest of 2024, are there any insights that we can draw from December's spending data when it comes to what we can expect going into the year? We are approaching those Easter holidays coming up. Does the data show us any trends when it comes to that consumer confidence and consumers opening up their wallets?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, it's times are tough. We know that. But again, December has just shown that you know, people are definitely still spending, and one could argue that it probably has an impact on inflation, the way in which people are continuing to spend. But what we're seeing is just from our transactional data, what we've seen in the last, say, 2 years or so, there's a continuous increase in not only spend transactions, but also transactions like EFT and real-time clearing transactions, as well as our recently launched PayShap, which is an immediate payment solution for transactions under 3,000 Rand. And we're excited to see how consumers are going to move more and more to the use of digital alternatives, like I've said, our immediate payment solution called PayShap, and see the country take that on as well. So it's interesting. If you ask me what's going to happen in the payments world over the next year, it's going to be very exciting. I think there's a proliferation of the number of digital alternatives that are available to consumers in order to move money between each other, not only pay for goods and services. So it's going to be interesting, and let's watch the space. I think everybody should keep an eye on the payments industry. The next year or two is going to be very exciting.
Well, we'll certainly be keeping an eye out. Solly, thank you so much for your time.